All right, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to CPERS, the Chinese Politics and Economy Research Seminar here at Georgetown University. I am Ning Ling, Assistant Professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy, and I organized this seminar along with my colleague, Professor Li Zhiliu, at the McDonald School of Business. CPERS is sponsored by the Department of Government and the Georgetown Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. Today, it is my great pleasure to have Professor Ho-Fung Hong to kick off our seminar series for the spring semester. Professor Hong is the Henry and Elizabeth Weisenfeld Professor in Political Economy at the Sociology Department and the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Hong's research focuses on global political economy, protest, and nation-state formation, with a focus on China and East Asia. He is an award-winning author of 4 books and an edited volume. In 2022 alone, he published 2 books with Cambridge University Press. One is called City on the Edge, Hong Kong Under Chinese Rule, and the other is called Clash of Empires, From Chimerica to the New Cold War. His previous books include, in 2015 with Columbia University Press, The China Boom, Why China Will Not Rule the World, and Protests with Chinese Characteristics, Demonstrations, Riots, and Petitions in the Mid-Qing Dynasty, published with Columbia University Press in 2011. Professor Hong is also the author of numerous articles published on top academic journals, including the American Journal of Sociology and the American Sociological Review, among others. His academic publications have been translated into at least 11 different languages, and he's a familiar name on news media such as New York Times, Wall Street Journals, Financial Times, etc. Today, he will give us a talk on the political sociology of U.S.-China rivalry. Before the talk begins, I would like to remind our audience that this is a webinar, so please save your questions to the Q&A session at the end. To ask a question, please put it in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and I'll read it out for you. So without further ado, welcome Professor Hong, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ling and DG, for inviting me. Unfortunately, we cannot do it in person, but I bet everybody's nice and comfy and warm at home or wherever to attend this meeting. And so let me share my PowerPoint, and it should take a second or so that I think it is working. So actually, this I have been giving this talk since the late Trump era, when I start to conceive about the book that came out in 2022. Is a little book in the Cambridge Edmund series, Clash of Empires. And then it was translated into Korean and just out in the Chinese version published in Taiwan. And every time I give the talk, I find it easier and easier to talk about. Not because I'm more used to the topic and with all these anticipated questions and comments, but also because in the beginning of the talk, people are in doubt because in the late Trump era, people are asking whether this U.S.-China rivalry is just caused by one person, that is Trump. But I'm and whether it will change, whether it would change with a new Democratic administration. That at that time I need to argue very hard to convince people that it is actually structural forces at play, that it is beyond control of one particular president, that is Trump. And I at that time I predicted that this U.S.-China rivalry will continue and even deteriorate even with a Democratic administration. And people were find it difficult at that time, found it difficult to believe. But in the end, that it turned out that it is the case, and it has some subtle transformation in the forms of the rivalry and competition, but actually the big direction hasn't changed. And also that the main arguments hinge on one major argument of my previous book, that is the China Boom, published in 2015. That is I argue that one root cause of the deteriorating U.S.-China relation is the slowdown and even the economic crisis in China. That back in 2017 and 2018, that even though many expert economists already have seen that for a while, that China's economy was in trouble, but it is not very kind of a common knowledge or obvious knowledge, and people still don't believe that China was in the economic crisis. But now it is becoming more obvious, even though it over adjusts and people exaggerated the crisis. But But it is common knowledge now. So it is easier and easier to make the argument. But every time that there's some new evidence coming up to show the future direction of how this is going, so I do a lot of updates, and I will get to that at the very end or at the Q&A about how this US-China rivalry is going and what are the different scenarios. So to get back to the political sociology part, is that actually there has been different takes on in terms of explaining the US-China rivalry before 2022, when the rivalry just started to get the attention, academic attention, and of course that the political scientists or people in the policy circle would look at the so-called foreign policy elite, drawing from the perspective that actually the Stephen Kreisler classic published in the 1970s, Defending the National Interest, is a book, part of the Bringing the State Back in School, with Fidel Skocpol and Charles Tilly, who argue that actually in terms of foreign policy, the US foreign policy is driven by national interest, geopolitical calculation, security consideration, rather than economic interest. So and fast forward to the 2010s and 2020s, and Stephen Ward published this recent book, The Hell of Good Intention. So basically, he explained U.S. foreign policy from the U.S. decision to go to war to different places and to go to more confrontational stance toward China in terms of the definition of reality and definition of national interest of the what he called the foreign policy elite. So he see it as a kind of a group of state elite who has their own worldview and their own interests, and pretty much isolated from corporate interests. So basically, it is a kind of a view that is against the explanation of U.S. foreign policy in terms of corporate interests. So it is kind of anti-Marxian explanation of U.S. foreign policy. It is not that transnational corporation dictating U.S. foreign policy. It is the U.S. foreign policy elite who, out of consideration of national interests and geostrategic calculation, to make decision about who are friends and who are enemies, and where to go to war. So in the foreign policy circle, of course, that we have Michael Pillsbury in the Republican side, and Rush Doshi in the Democratic side, who was in the Biden administration National Security Council, who explained the China side, why China become more and more confrontational and assertive in terms of not economic interest, but geostrategic calculation of the Chinese state elite. So it is very state-centric, statist explanation of foreign policy on both the US side and the China side. So it's basically this state elite calculating the national security considerations and geostrategic interests to decide who are friends and who are enemies, and where to go to war with, and things like that. So this first status explanation, I would say, is a Weberian. That if you are sociologists or political scientists who are into theory, you know what it means. And of course, and on the other hand, there are always people who are more tilted toward the Marxian explanation, to look at state foreign policy on both the US side and the China side in terms of corporate interests. And for example, that we have William Robinson classic explaining US policy in Latin America, in other places in the world, in terms of the economic lead of the transnational capitalist class. And more recently, that is this agents of neoliberal globalization, and looking at the U.S. trade policy, and from that forward, that foreign policy is pretty much shaped by the U.S. TNC's interests. And on the European academia and sociologists, you have this Lana de Graaf book about how the US changed its grand strategies from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, from the quantitative analysis of TNC's networks across the Atlantic and Pacific, to basically it is a kind of a new reiterations of this corporate interest explanation of US foreign policy and hegemonic strategies. And at the same time, on the China side, that we have Scott Kennedy Classic again, that who argue in this book published in the 2000s that actually in China, a lot of policy, not only economic policy, but also trade policy, foreign policies are related to this kind of business lobbying in China. That is, the state enterprise, private enterprise, they have business association. So basically, this classic is showing that actually in China, also the corporate interest is very important in shaping policies, not only the state elite interest. So we have this kind of two explanation, big framework to explain policy change on the China side and on the US side, the Weberian one that focus on the state elite interests and calculation and disposition, and the more Marxian view, not necessarily Marxian view, but to look at alternative way to look at the corporate interests on both sides in shaping policy. So my take on this is this. Of course, they're both one-sided. Actually, you need to combine the both area of interest, state elite interest and the corporate interest to explain the timing and the shift and the dynamics of the change in US policy toward China and also China policy toward the US. And I would, to summarize my argument in one sentence, is I would actually arguing that the geopolitical and state elite interest is a kind of a sufficient, necessary but not sufficient condition to lead to this kind of a US-China rivalry. You need to have both the state elite and the corporate elite aligned. So the corporate interest is a sufficient condition for this kind of moving the U.S.-China relation from the more friendly relation to a kind of a rival relation. Because if you only look at geopolitics and grand strategies, and people tend to forget that right after the end of Cold War, actually that there was an intensifying geopolitical competition already between China and US in the 1990s. There's over the South China Sea, you look at this Foreign Affairs article that it has a count of South China Sea instance that China having skirmishes or different kind of conflict with US allies in the regions, and actually it started to climb up significantly in the 1990s, right after Cold War. And at that time, the U.S. Military and foreign policy elite also start to talk about this China being the most significant challenge to U.S. interests in the Pacific after the fall of the Soviet Union. And 1996, when, if you remember, that Huntington published the book Clash of Civilization, of course, people focus on the Muslim part, but actually he also said that that the cynic world, what he called, is going to be increasingly assertive and establish an alliance with Muslim countries to take down the Western hegemony. So this Sino-Muslim alliance is very discussed prominently in the Clash of Civilization book. So in the 1990s, from a geopolitical perspective, you already see this kind of US-China rivalry emerging, and let alone the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996, and also the Kosovo U.S. bombing of Chinese embassy during the Kosovo War in Belgrade in 1999, and also the of course the first year of George W. Bush administration 2001, right before the 9/11, we have the South China Sea spy plane incidents in which actually literally a U.S. Reconnaissance plane and the Chinese fighter jet clash, and then the U.S. plane was forced landed in Hainan, and there's a diplomatic crisis. So it's all this geopolitical tension is already building up, and the discourse from the geopolitical and military elite on both sides is already heating up. But this kind of heating up of geopolitical tension back in the 1990s did not prevent US-China getting into actually more and more friendly relation overall in the 1990s and 2000s. And even if you look at ideology, that 1990s, you already see that right after 1989, the crackdown on Tiananmen, that already that this kind of ideological difference between China and the US is already very apparent. by late 1990s and early 2000s, and nobody is believing that China is moving toward a political liberalization very seriously. Andrew Levin wrote that article about authoritarian resilience in early 2000s, and basically everybody, not everybody, but most people already have a consensus that China is becoming actually more and more authoritarian. So this ideological explanation or geopolitical explanation of U.S.-China deteriorating relation cannot explain the timing of that deterioration. But because if you believe that it is ideology and geopolitical interests, the difference in the political system that drive the conflict, then why the conflict didn't become bad until late 2010s and 2020s. And if it is the driving force, if they are the driving force, it should have already very bad in the 1990s and 2000s. So what is different between the 1990s and 2000s and the 2010s is the U.S. corporate interests that originally, after the end of Cold War, when globalization started in 1993, 1994, you went back to the literature. If you go back to the literature, look at what people are discussing about globalization. People are focusing on NAFTA, on Mexico, on Latin America. Not many people initially think about China will be the new frontier of globalization because it's right after Tiananmen. It is uncertain about U.S.-China relation, and in 1993, when Bill Clinton was campaigning, he advocate linking China trade with human rights and saying that if China didn't improve human rights, then China export to the U.S. will lose the low tariff advantage. So basically that it is very uncertain time that so people and corporate are not sure initially about how China is important for their business, and when people talking about globalization, then people focus on NAFTA, South America, and so on and so forth. But then the situation changed in the early 1990s and 93 and 94 because I will fast forward because it is basically in my previous period folks that actually China was in the economic crisis and balance of payment crisis, and in 92, 93, after Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour, actually that people praised Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour in 1992 to restart the economy after the stagnation after 1989. But actually, immediate aftermath of this Southern Tour is not very good economically. It led to overheating, hyperinflation above 20%, and the balance of payment crisis that China see the depletion of foreign exchange reserve. So actually that when Zhu Rongji became the vice premier of China at that time in early 1990s, he was in a kind of a crisis management mode to get China out of this crisis of overheating. Debt crisis, balance of payment crisis in 92, 93. And at that time that they're really panicking because Soviet Union just collapsed. So the CCP really worry about the economy. And interestingly, in 92, 93, you look at the Congress record, and Nancy Pelosi was making a speech saying that we wait a little bit, and other round of student protests is going to flare up very soon, because 1989 was ignited by the inflation. And then now the inflation in 92, 93 is actually higher than 88, 89. So we will see unrest. So there is all this kind of a thing, a lot looking good. So Zhu Rongji at that time, and the CCP at large is very in kind of anxiety mode, so much so that in 1993, in October, there was a kind of a Zhu Rongji called all these rural cadres to Beijing to tell them the shift of policy. Tell them the countryside need to sacrifice to solve this crisis, because in the 1980s all the way to early 1990s, China, the growth model was domestic oriented and rural oriented, and the reform focused on agricultural area with a lot of township village enterprise, agricultural investment. And then in the speech at that time the full speech was not disclosed, but after Zhu Rongji retired, they published all his speech, and now we all can find it handily. And then actually he's basically in the speech saying that we have this problem because we favor the countryside too much in the past. They eat up the resources, eat up the labor, So it's why in the urban area we have this invasion and overheating and all this problem. And now we need to slow down the development of township village enterprise and agriculture. And also more importantly, to shift the economy significantly to an export-oriented mode to give a big boost to all these the coastal export zones. At the same time, start to slow down and even disinvest on township village enterprise, rural industries, and agriculture. So it was this policy that created this kind of rural unemployment in the mid 1990s that start the kind of a rural urban migration that people can no longer find expanding job opportunities in the rural industries, and they need to go all the way to South China, to Shenzhen, to Dongguan, and to Kunshan, and all these coastal places to work in foreign factories for export. So it is this whole plan, and also, of course, then in January 1st, 1994, China also did a one-shot big devaluation of the currency to boost export. So it is this huge shift of economic model that's actually successfully solved the crisis. But at the same time, in 1993, it's not obvious that this thing will work, because right at the time when China is going in full force to shift the economy to export-oriented development to solve the crisis, that U.S. has Bill Clinton came in office in 1993, and then his policy is to actually using trade as a leverage to push China to improve human rights condition. And in 1993, May 1993, Clinton declared that there's a laundry list of things that China need to improve on regarding human rights. Otherwise, if any one of them is not fulfilled, and then China will lose its most favored nation status, meaning that China goods tariff for China goods in the U.S. will be raised significantly. So it really created a huge uncertainty of this kind of Zhurongji strategy to move China to export-oriented mode of development, when the U.S. at the time still is the single biggest national economy's market for Chinese goods. So it is very uncertain. So that time then, 93, 94, Beijing launched a lobbying campaign to invite all these U.S. corporations to China to tell them that to help lobby the U.S. government to take out the human right conditionality on China goods tariff access to the U.S. And they target the most influential corporation, not necessarily the corporation that has a vested interest in trade. And they target energy enterprise like this Amoco and all this oil company by offering drilling rights and extraction rights in South China Sea and Inner Mongolia for all these natural gas fields and oil fields. And also AT&T is a big player and big lobby on behalf of China at the time, because China at the time promised AT&T that, not kind of promise, they even signed an MOU saying that AT&T will be a big part in participating in China's telecommunication market liberalization. And so actually the AT&T CEO at the time published an article saying that AT&T is for China, in China, with China. So the AT&T is going to have a big role in participating in China telecommunication market. And the lobbying records show that AT&T is the most important enterprise that actually lobby U.S. Congress and the White House to take out the human right conditionality on China goods low tariff access to the U.S. So with this intensive lobbying efforts in 1994, that Clinton famously, the Clinton administration famously take out the human right conditionality on China goods low tariff access to U.S. market, which is the famous delinking. That is, and then of course the justification is that the Clinton shift from the policy that is supported by the labor union at the time, because they think that this human right thing can be a good gate against Chinese imports that will threaten U.S. jobs. But then Clinton, under the intense lobbying of U.S. corporation and take out this human right conditionality and pursue alternative theory that you don't need to talk about human right at all. You just do trade with China, and then with this globalization and trade and mutual investment, and China will absorb a lot of Western ideas, and in the end, it will lead to liberalization. So you don't need to separate it and independently talk about human right, and human right will come automatically if we do trade with China. So it is a 1994 big shift in policy, thanks to the corporate lobbying on the U.S. side. So I don't go into the detail here. So it is the argument is in this previous book, and some of the arguments in China Boom that is also translate in simplified Chinese characters, and my favorite story that I don't have time to go into, and that when they translated the Zhongxin, the CITIC press in Beijing translated, and recently they did the second edition, and I take a whole of the copy, and then they don't cut out or change any content, but there's one place that they systematically change the content or the wording, is that whenever I talk about capitalism in China, the changes to market socialism with Chinese characteristics. So it is not capitalism. You cannot talk about capitalism in China. So it is in which respect it is very important that why they insist that what China has is not capitalism. It is the private property right thing, and the land property particularly, that they still define China is fundamentally a socialist system, never a capitalist system. But if I have time, I can talk more about it, but I don't. But so it is the 1994 MFN debate, and you see this kind of a U.S. business invited by China to visit China, peak in 93 and 94, and then I look at the People's Daily, and then they all are U.S. CEO from AT&T, from Amoco, from ExxonMobil, that they are all kind of, and explicitly that the Chinese government is giving them a lot of promise and favors, and in exchange for their effort to lobby the U.S. government to take out the human rights condition on Chinese goods access to U.S. market. So the rest of is history. And once this kind of China got this permanent normal trade relation, or later it is called normal trade relation, and at that time it's called the most favored relation, then U.S. manufacturers start to invest big times in China, and actually this interesting lot like you look at the corporate history of Apple, that they didn't actually have a lot of stake in China until 2000s, late 1990s, and in the beginning that they manufacture all the computer and electronic products in the California and Colorado factory, and they manufacture the product for the Asian market in the Singapore factory, and they manufacture the product for the Europe market in the Ireland factory. That in the 1990s they are not interested in China at all in the beginning, but it was later that they were drawn into the China market after China got into WTO, actually. So they're the latecomer. But initially, most companies, after the Clinton dropped the human rights conditions on China goods, low tariff access to U.S. market, that they start to innovate, motivated by Wall Street, actually, that the Wall Street kind of stakeholder values principle, and is driving all these companies to seek the lowest cost possible, and then China is opening up, and with this human rights uncertainty getting rid of, so they start to go into China en masse, and then so it created a kind of a self-perpetuating momentum. So they keep lobbying Congress for favorable policy toward China, not only on trade, but also on many policy, geopolitics, human rights, and everything else, because they know that they lobby on behalf of China in the DC, that they will get favor back when their business expand in China. So in the 1990s and 2000s, the pattern is that whenever there's somebody from actually that Bernie Sanders at that time that is already talking about having more protectionist barriers against China goods. At that time, he was in the House of Representatives, not yet a senator, but you can see this the progressive wing of the Democrats and tied to labor union is already talking about tariff against China goods. And also Nancy Pelosi and all these human rights people are already having sometimes this kind of human rights bills targeting about China against China. But every time when you have this kind of bill floating around in Congress, it never get anywhere because the corporate lobbying against those bills is very prevalent. So much so that even though they initiate the bill, they know that there's low chance that it will pass, so they drop it. And it's many of the bills that even couldn't get to voting. So they know that it is a waste of time at that time. So in the 1990s and 2000s, it is the situation that this U.S. corporate lobbying become a very important brick or check on all this kind of a hawkish tendency, whatever it is, from the geopolitical elite, from the human rights activists, and so on and so forth. So the corporate interest is basically putting a cap on this possibility of deteriorating relation, despite the geopolitical tension already increasing at that time, as I mentioned earlier. So much so that in the rest is history, and then it's my favorite cartoon in 2009 New York Times, and it accompanied Neil Ferguson article on Chimerica. So they say that he's basically the argument now. He, of course, that the Chimerica has ended. He said, but back then he said that China and U.S. is already integrated into one national economy. So he even called China the West Trimerica, and then U.S. is the East Trimerica, as it is the East Coast and West Coast of the same country. So at that time, even that there's a lot of these different terms like G2 is a term that some people in the UK and US and China also talk about, meaning that G7, G20, they are not relevant. Only G2 is relevant in governing the world. That is US and China. That is the two big countries co-governing the world. So it is the vision at the time that is the huge integration. So at that time, really that this geopolitical tension and human rights consideration and ideological difference didn't prevent US and China coming together because of this corporate interest. But what changed after 2010 is first is the change on the China side. And it is a complicated graph it looked like, but actually it's really simple. That is the PMI, that's purchasing the manager index measure. There's a Chinese official data, and also Caixin, and used to be HSBC, has a private data. Look at the ups and downs of the Chinese economy. That I don't need to talk about it too much now, because it's obvious that before this 59 is the kind of a stagnation line. Above it is expansion of manufacturing activities, and below it is contraction. You see that before 2008 global financial crisis, it has been expanding robustly, and then the global financial crisis hit, and then China pull out the successful stimulus through loans and lending to build stuff, airports and high-speed rail, and steel mill, coal plants, apartments. But then actually around 2010, it already become obvious that this rebounds after the post 2008 global financial crisis stimulus is already tapering off. By the time of 2011 and afterward, you see this kind of Chinese manufacturing. The surface also is a bit better, but actually showed a similar pattern. So it's hovering around the stagnation line, and then the yellow line is this kind of a new loans created by the Chinese banking system. You see this pattern is that whenever the economy tank to a certain degree, then the state bank mostly it's open the floodgate to lend and then to stimulate it back up. But then it only up a little bit, and then it went when it go up, and then the government start to worry about this indebtedness of the economy and all this non-performing loan. So they the flow of loan slowed, and then the economy went back down. So it is this up and downs, and you see this kind of a surge of loan. Each round is bigger than the other. So what I see is this kind of a addiction to debt, meaning that in the beginning, that's just like drug addiction. In the beginning, a small dose can create a huge stimulus, but then when it goes on, then and you need a stronger and stronger dose of debt to create a smaller and smaller stimulus. It's just like drug addiction, that you need stronger and stronger dose to create a smaller and smaller excitement. And in fact, and every time that have this surge in loan, that many enterprise and local government are using it to refinance the previous loan, and rather than putting it to productive use, and so that this kind of a crisis we see today, that is this heavily indebted like Evergrande and all this enterprise, and actually the high-speed rail, the railroad system is already insolvent for a long time, need the government rescue all the time. So there's already there in the early 2000s. But it's not obvious until after COVID. But people who look at the data already know this problem, and of course, it's political elite know the problem. So when Xi Jinping came in, that he already inherited a slowing economy. So in the first few years after 2013, he came in, and he's like scrambling to try different methods to try to find a new motor of the economy. And there's a lot of attempt. And it is all this kind of attempt didn't work that he go down this current status path. Actually, it's not starting with him. As I argued, that actually start in late Hu Jintao era, when this state enterprise start to become more and more prominent at the expense of private enterprise and foreign enterprise. And of course, there's other attempts, and like moving China to high tech. That is one of it, but it didn't work as well as planned. There's some progress definitely, but it is not as good as they expected. It didn't become the new motor of the economy, and then they pour a lot of money for strategic sector like microchips now, and EV and all this. But the pattern it created is not as high quality as planned. So much so that in 2022, actually, the Chinese government launched a Blue Sky campaign to crack down on fake patent. And then now it all came to light that a lot of patent is like they're cheating, that these research institutions and companies got the state funding and then claim that they create several dozens of new patents, but many of them are actually that low quality and low commercial value patents. Some of them outright that they even patent selling companies, and then create this kind of a fake patent for this kind of a research grant holder to buy and things like that. So in 2022, the government start to crack down. So this and China still rely on foreign technology in these key sectors, and this profit rates has been falling definitely. And then you look at this balance of payment of intellectual property rights. It is one of the origin of the U.S.-China deteriorating relation is this intellectual property right. That you look at the export mix of China. It's true that China is exporting more and more high-tech product, but the high-tech product, most of them, actually the high-tech components are from foreign companies, or they're using foreign technology. They need to pay the foreign patent holder of that technology to manufacture that product. So if you look at the balance of payment of patent, intellectual property right, that is other countries paying your country for intellectual property right minus the aggregate amount of money that your country paid foreign country for patent to use foreign country patent. So you see that when U.S. trade deficit is increasing, its balance of payment of intellectual property right is also increasing, because when other countries are manufacturing export back to the U.S., that many of these foreign exporters are using U.S. technology. They need to pay patent holder the patent fees. So the U.S. is actually when it is running the trade deficit, is actually running a huge intellectual property surplus. And South Korea, Germany, and Japan, they used to be a deficit country, but they move up the value chain, and then they have a lot of homegrown patent. So they Germany and Japan go into surplus. And China is interesting that you see China trade surplus is expanding all the time, but this intellectual property right deficit is also increasing. And the famous example is, of course, the iPhone. That iPhone is manufactured in China, export to US and the rest of the world, but a lot of patents of the technology and the high-tech component is actually belong to Apple, or manufactured by other high-tech firms. For example, a lot of components is actually manufactured by Samsung, and some European companies for this high-tech part of it. So it is the technological scene. So when China have this Made in China 20 Is it 2050, 2030? I already we forget about the target year when they claimed that China need to be technologically sufficient. And then they pour a lot of money on R&D, and it didn't work out very well. In the end, that we sought to intellectual property right or intellectual property or patent technology transfer from foreign company that including U.S. company. So that it become one impetus of the U.S. corporation this position toward China turned from amicable to increasingly sour because of this acquisition of IP theft. So at the same time, of course, we have got Belt and Road. Actually, that one solution that the Chinese government is helping the U.S. The Chinese state-owned or private company that is a free XCMG, SANY, and Zoomlion are the three biggest construction machine manufacturer in China. SANY is a private company that Zoomlion and XCMG is a state owned company. You all see that this revenue growth is in the very robust in the stimulus years when they're building airport, high-speed rail, apartments and factories. But then it got into negative territory when this China stimulus effect taper off when China run out of thing to build. And then after 2014 and 15, and it turned around and become very robust growth in revenues again. And then I look at the company reports of these Chinese machines maker. They're all talking about we run out of space for growth in the China market. Most of our new orders come from Pakistan and Kazakhstan and Sri Lanka and Africa and all these Belt and Road countries. So basically, Belt and Road, people talk about debt trap and all this kind of thing, but I don't think China is setting up a deliberate debt trap to trap the developing country. And what China is doing is what they have been doing domestically, but turn inside out to foreign countries. That is to use the state banks to lend money to people to hire these Chinese contractors and buy Chinese construction machine to build stuff. And so they did it domestically in the 2009-2010 stimulus, but once the stimulus taper off, that they do it through Belt and Road and do it to other countries. And they create the same problem of indebtedness and overcapacity and all this problem that like Sri Lanka and Pakistan is facing a lot of this problem, and it is this problem by nature is not very different from the problem of Evergrande and the lender of to Evergrande, that they just lend money to them to build stuff, and then the stuff is not economically in the end, so they cannot repay the debt, and then so it is just a problem. But you see that expansion is driven by this China economic slowdown and exporting spare capacity capital as a remedy, and then it is the second impetus that Chinese and U.S. companies is running a foe with Chinese companies, because you look at the U.S. companies report and U.S. Chamber of Commerce and things like that, they are already complaining about Chinese competition. They are being squeezed out first from the Chinese market and then in the Belt and Road countries market. And then one documented in media and openly in open sources is like Caterpillar is one example. You look at their complaining that this Chinese construction machine maker used to be their partner in joint venture, helping Caterpillar to build stuff for the China market, but later on that they have their separate line that creating and manufacturing the construction machine that look very alike Caterpillar machine, but selling much cheaper. First in the China market and then in all these Belt and Road markets. So Caterpillar is like losing market share to this Chinese construction machine maker. So that during the Obama administration, they lobby the Obama administration to have free trade agreement with Latin America, explicitly citing that without free trade agreement with Latin American country, we are losing out the market to all these Asian, particularly Chinese construction machine. So it is interesting. It is documented. I can talk about it because that at least in the media and things like that, that Caterpillar lobbying patent regarding China change. And a lot of companies are like that in the 1990s and 2000, many companies who used to lobby on behalf of Chinese interests or lobby against a bill that is unfriendly with China. After 2010s, you look at the lobbying database, and many of these associations and US companies start to at least they become silent about lobbying on behalf of China. They no longer lobby for China, and at the same time, some of them even lobby for policy that raise tariff on China. So I don't have time to look at these examples, but if you are interested in any of them, I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, and it is actually documented in my book. And AT&T is interesting because it's very typical. As I said, AT&T is very instrumental in the 1990s in helping to lobby for taking out the human rights conditions on China trade, even though they don't really have much to do with trade, but because of the expectation that they will be conquering the China telecommunication market at that time. So they're very happy to lobby in that direction. But after the human rights condition is taken out and China changed the policy and saying that telecommunication is of significant importance, and so foreign company cannot participate in the market, and they cultivated state-owned companies and China Mobile, China Telecom, and then now you don't see AT&T at all, minimally, that in China market. It's all Chinese state-owned telecommunication market that dominates. So AT&T is very typical that they with a promise that they do a lot, but then the promise is not fulfilled actually. And there are many other examples, and so that already in 2011 you can already start to see that when Hu Jintao visiting the White House and Obama for the first time openly, at that time it is caught attention because it is unheard of before. It is complaining to Hu about that China treatment of U.S. companies, and it is a result of U.S. corporate lobbying, because the corporation, they still have business in China. They don't want to be vocal to complain, but they complain behind the door and through this association like U.S. Chamber of Commerce, all these manufacturing associations. And then so we don't see the companies on openly still say good things about China and very polite, but then behind the door you already see these associations and through this backdoor channel that they already putting pressure on the White House to lobby on China. So it is why actually the US policy toward China start to shift in the Obama second term with the TPP, that the Trans-Pacific Partnership thing. And the whole point is to isolate China and put pressure on China. And then the pivot to the Asia, that this kind of a U.S. Levy, the LAFO emphasize becoming targeting containing China in the Pacific. It started in the second Obama administration. So there's a lot of example again that I don't have time to talk about, and there's a lot of cases already that in the Department of Justice and looking into this kind of a technological theft case that again the company won't be too vocal to talk about it, but you look at the lawsuit and then all these cases, you know that it is already happening. And this interesting case that well documented because it is AMSC, American Superconductor. When Trump started the trade war, they get interviewed a lot because they are saying that this kind of a trade war came just too late. It should have come earlier because they have been harvesting our technology, stealing our technology for decades, and we can never recover. And so it is against Sinovel Group, that is the wind turbine, the manufacturing in China. They lead the kind of a high-tech component and the driver from this American company. So it is a big business. The company is a kind of a poster child of green technology in the Obama era. But then all of a sudden the company nearly bankrupt because the China canceled all the contract with the company because China say that they can now manufacture the high-tech component themselves. It turned out that China, just like the Chinese company, Sinovel, just bought off disgruntled employees of the company in Europe to download all the blueprint to transfer to the Chinese company. And it is all established cases. There's a lawsuit, and then the Sinovel was fined quite a hefty amount of fine by the U.S. courts, and also the employee doing the downloading and transferring is behind bar now. But the company, the AMSC, they're still disgruntled and say that they will never recover from this. And so when Trump started the trade war, they celebrated and say that it's just too late. So it is the interesting thing that so you look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce survey of U.S. companies in China, that all the 2010s is pointing to this direction, is that this companies make in 2025. Yes, that is when they say that China is going to be technological sufficient in 2025. It means that it is a long release of technological transfer that they're going to squeeze U.S. company to surrender all this high-tech secret. So this, at least from the perspective of the companies, it is the case. And then they are complaining it not individually as enterprise, again, because they are business that still have business in China. They worry about that, so they won't be too vocal. But through this Chamber of Commerce survey, they already showed this complaint. And in 2017, when Trump came in, the White House, that the concern in the U.S. communities of business is that Trump will be too soft on China. So they published this report to show that the concern of the business community, and then to make sure that Trump won't be soft on China. So it is the beginning of the Trump administration, and the rest is history. So so it is all this data I have in this book is like lawsuit of U.S. companies against Chinese entities over intellectual property. So it actually skyrocket after 2010. And also U.S. company exposure and export to China, and in the top 10 Fortune 500 companies and top 30, you see this plateaued after 2010 and even start to fall. And now now we read the news and you find out that actually it is actually accelerating. Even like the portfolio investment is pulling out from China's stock market, but the trend actually started in 2010s. And also the corporation lobbying U.S. Congress, mentioning complaint about the intellectual property right issues and market access issue, actually rose and peak around 2010 and stay in a high level. And then you can see one of these kind of some of this group that lobby for this has a wide range of stakeholders in the U.S. National Chicken Council, Playboy, Morgan Stanley, United Steelworkers, and conservative for property rights. So it is a wide range of U.S. business. Is relation with China turns sour. So to conclude that actually that in the 1990s and 2000s, that the geopolitical difference and tension and ideological difference alone did not prevent the rise of this Chimerica and the U.S.-China integration on all fronts and cooperation, because the U.S. corporations are the brake on any deterioration, and actually they are the ambassador of mutually. But the global financial crisis 2008 is a turning point, and China pull out a successful stimulus, but the stimulus taper off, and then with overcapacity and all the problem that Chinese corporation is struggling, and then the Chinese government respond to this Chinese company struggle to help them through getting the foreign technology and also squeezing foreign enterprise out first in domestic market and in the Belt and Road market, and then it create this kind of U.S. corporation no longer be the ambassador of China's voice and interest in the U.S. political system, and so the geopolitical hawks and the ideological and human rights activists can be the upper hand and unrestrained. And you can see that recent legislation about China human rights in Congress is the only thing that you can get bipartisan wide support and sometimes even unanimous support. It is unthinkable in 1990s and 2000, and it's the opposite at that time. Whenever you have some bill voting in Congress unfriendly with China on all kind of issues, that people will expect that it won't pass, and then so it won't even get to the voting, and then it will be like that before delivery. But right now, that whenever there's a bill that is on the U.S. side that is hostile and not so friendly with China about human rights and everything else, and then you can get unanimous sometime and the vast majority, large margin, bipartisan support. So it is the situation that is a structural condition of this U.S.-China deterioration, then let me end here, and I look forward to the questions, and I will get to this future possible scenario. That the take-home point, of course, is that this deterioration is not going anywhere. It's going to continue. The question is what form it is going to take, that we can have some agency to shape the form of it. But the general direction of deterioration is not going to change, given the structural forces has not changed. But thank you for your patience. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Hong, for such an informative talk. So now we're opening up to Q&A. Everyone, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. So if you have any questions, please put it there. I'll kick off with one question about the American corporations that have long been puzzling me. So when you mentioned a lot of these intellectual property violation cases, and these, for example, the wind power that happened way back in like 2026 and even before. So a lot of them was done with this forced technology transfer and joint venture form, right? Set, I think, in mainland China. So how come the foreign companies, why did they agree to the forced technology transfer, and why did they agree to build joint venture when they saw this coming?
Yeah, definitely. That is a short-term incentive, but this kind of in the 2000s and 2010, so the economic pie of China is expanding. So the idea is that you know that this technology transfer is happening, but you can always run faster with more advanced technology. Let them take the older one. It still hurt, but compared to the expansion of business in China, they do the calculation and think that it is a net gain. So it is some necessary cost of it is that you have some technology get appropriated, and your competitor, your joint venture companies can get the technology. But then two things. That one is that this kind of technological appropriation become more and more aggressive and getting to more and more core of the business. And at the same time, the Chinese economy is no longer growing that fast. And so the calculus between cost and benefit change. It become a net loss. Many companies decide it is a net loss, and so they start to decide to reduce the presence in China or become more assertive about this kind of technological intellectual property issues. And also the third market is also the issue. Before China going on massively, they think that they might lose market share in China, but they at least they can still have the rest of the world. But now with the Belt and Road, and China companies not only competing with them in the China market, they are competing with them in all developing countries market, even European market. You go to Europe, that a lot of people are using Huawei and Xiaomi and things like that. In US, it's a bit tough to crack, but in Europe, really, that there's a lot of competition, and let alone construction machines. And you look at the construction site and what machine they're doing, that I see less and less Caterpillar, that more and more Chinese construction machines. So this calculus change when the economy slow down and the Chinese state become more and more aggressive in all this kind of technological appropriation. But of course, another side of the story is that it is not unique to China. When Japan and Korea and Taiwan took off in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the US company have the same issue, exact same issue with this technological transfer. That accusing Japanese company and Korean company and Taiwan company of appropriate intellectual property right. What is different is that it is interesting that the US under the lobby of this corporation that put pressure on Japanese government, Taiwan government, and Korean government to show up intellectual property right protection. At that time, of course, and as in now, that Korea, Taiwan, Japan is allied of the US, that they depend on the US on national security and many other things. So they are weaker politically, and so they have to yield to US pressure to show up intellectual property right. And then at the time, of course, the left wing in Japan and Taiwan, Korea saying it is imperialist encouragement of the national interest. But in the end, that the unintended consequence of this yielding to US pressure in Korea, Taiwan, and Japan is that after you show up this intellectual property right protection, initially you are protecting intellectual property right of US corporation, but in the end, you also create the infrastructures for local intellectual property right development and innovation. People really has an incentive to invent real big profitable stuff without being lead to worry being appropriated. So I think it is a kind of paradox of weakness that the yield to US pressure in the end they benefit, and Japan and Korea and Taiwan is most significant. You look at the history of their microchips developments and things like that. So it impossible without this intellectual property right protection institution that they set up because of US pressure. The China encountered this kind of a interesting paradox of strength. US is doing the same thing to put pressure on China to show up intellectual property right protection. And the private sector of China is actually aligned with this. And you look at the article from Caixin and all this private sector, they said that in the end, you show up intellectual property right protection that private enterprise and Chinese enterprise can benefit in the long run. But because China is so strong geopolitically, so they don't think that it is good to yield to US pressure to do whatever US telling them to do. So it is delayed. I'm not saying that it is delayed forever, but slower, much slower than what Japan and Taiwan and Korea did back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it is why China have this kind of a path dependent, not in this path of getting technology through technological appropriation from foreign enterprise rather than indigenous innovation, and all the scandals and campaign to crack down on corruptions in the innovation sector in China is exactly showing this, that they when you don't have a intellectual property right legal infrastructures, then what you can resort to is this kind of ad hoc campaign to crack down and arrest all these people who appropriate money and then didn't innovate and things like that. But in the long run, that it is very different trajectory compared to earlier East Asian economies.
Thank you. And then we have 4 questions now in Q&A. I'll try to group them together. So the first question is from Tim Barley. To put it briefly, are human rights concerns completely epiphenomenal in your account, or do you see transnational advocacy as having any causal impact?
Yeah, it's interestingly that thank Tim for the question. I know that you're working on environmental issue as well, so you might want to hear about it. That actually it is important that human right and also labor right, environmental rights, and then it is a kind of a necessary but not sufficient condition to turn the relation bad. And actually, you look at the 1999 Seattle protests against WTO, there's a lot of union participation, and they're already pointing at China as a kind of a big problem, that they are going to attack US labor right and violating environmental right. But at that time, it didn't stop US from supporting China getting into the WTO. But interestingly, that and now that the situation shift, and then this labor right, environmental rights in the U.S. political process become a lot dominant, but actually more important thing. So you see that the U.S. trade representative, when they are striking trade deal and the renewed laughter, and also all this trade discussion in China, they explicitly put labor right and environmental right into consideration. And in the USMCA, which is the renewed version of LAFTA, they explicitly have this kind of labor right, labor standard, and environmental cost. Though some people think that it is toothless, but actually compared to the 1990s and 2000s, when the free trade ideology that you cannot talk about environmental and labor right, otherwise you create protectionism, that it is gone. So the interesting thing is that the pressure on China trade regarding environmental right and labor right and so big that I always point to that joint Russia-China statement right before the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, when Putin visit China and Xi Jinping and Putin issued a joint statement, and not many people noticed that. But actually, it's very interesting thing in that statement is that it's not only talk about NATO or not only talk about geopolitical stuff, but there's a paragraph about globalization. And then I'm sure that is the paragraph that China put in the debt, showing that China is worried. That they are saying that protectionism in the name of environmental protection is high. It is a big threat to globalization. big threat to prosperity. So China and Russia should fight against this kind of a protectionism in the names of environmentalism and human rights and labor rights, all that stuff. So now it seems that, like, interestingly, China is becoming the trade neoliberals, like in the 1990s and 2000s in the US, and saying that we only talk about trade, please don't talk about environment and human rights and labor rights, otherwise it becomes excuse for protectionism. But when China so worry about it, so much so that need to put this paragraph in the joint statement with Russia, meaning that it is really the tide has shifted and it now become a driving force in all this trade negotiation. And there's even voicing that China membership in the WTO need to be reconsidered and then take into consideration all these kind of environment and trade human rights issues and of course and the recent the Uyghur forced labor, I forgot the exact name of the bill that is passed in Congress, that to look at this kind of companies having operation in Xinjiang that need to prove that they don't use forced labor. So it is a kind of the exact reversal of the Clinton delinking. So it is the relinking human right with trade. That is that. So I think it is just the beginning, and then more will be coming. Particularly with if the Democrats is in power, that this kind of human right and also environmental right will be into consideration.
And then we have the next question on summits. So Raghav was asking, Xi stated that the world is big enough for both the US and China to succeed. Do you think there are any merits to these summits that emphasize US-China cooperation, or is deterioration of the relationship all but inevitable?
Yeah, I'm all for meeting and communications and as the recent summit in between Xi and Biden in California shows that actually that nobody has high expectation that it will bring any breakthrough, but to contain the conflict and to actually not to contain the conflict on economic terms, in trade and investment, it is actually is not going to improve anytime. You see that the Biden administration is still rolling out the regulation after regulations that restrain U.S. investment into Chinese stock markets and all this, and it is going to still bite. But to prevent the conflict from becoming geopolitical and military conflict is important. So I think this summit is important in this manner, so that the overall rivalry won't abate anytime soon. But if we manage through summit or through what they call it track to diplomacy or whatever it is, that to channel the competition to economic issues and to trade issues, to competition between the two countries in these the international organizations like the UN, WHO and WTO. So it is the best thing we can hope for, that to prevent the energy of this conflict from spilling into military area, and then to channel it to economic, education, and technological and global governing competition, so it can become potentially healthy competition. So we don't need to worry about the deterioration if the competition is channeled to this area. So this summit is useful in this sense.
Mm-hmm. And then next we have Jennifer Bui, and then she's asking, for the future, how would decoupling benefit U.S. corporations? And she'll be interested in your discussion of the future scenarios as well.
Yeah, thank you. I talked about it a little bit in my response to the previous question. That is the future scenario, of course, that the worst scenario is that is this military conflict scenario that nobody want to see. I don't think China want to see it as well. And at the last section of the book, I called it the U.S.-China conflict not a new Cold War, because like this Cold War analogy is wrong in the sense that it is eye-catching, but it is wrong because like based on ideology and political difference. But as I said, that the U.S.-China difference is primarily is not ideology and political. That it is part of it, but not the core of it. And another big difference between U.S.-China competition and the old original Cold War is that when Soviet Union and the U.S. is competing over the loyalty of the third country, and the third country, whoever that is, and Chile or Philippines or Indonesia, they need to make an existential choice. When they side with the Soviet Union or side with the US, it's not only about alliance, it's also about what kind of social, economic, political system your country is going to choose. Nail down to this kind of a private property that when a Latin American country, for example, is moving towards Soviet Union, that all these property owner will worry that it will go down the Cuba path and become socialists and nationalizations and then this whole totally socialist system. So when during the old Cold War, that any countries who decide whether to shift between USSR and the US, it is the existential choice of their own country about what system so to adopt. So this different political force within that country could fight to the extreme, even at the kind of mode of coup or civil war, to make sure that the country is on one side or the other side. But right now, the US-China competition is totally different. That if you are third countries choosing between the US and China, it is not an existential choice for your political, social, economic system. You can shift between US and China back and forth a few times without changing the basic political system, economic system, and social system of your country. So it is less consequential for any third country to choose between the US and China. So it is very different. So the US-China competition is more like Germany and UK in the early 20th century, when UK and Germany was allies in the late 19th century and early 20th century, but in the 1910s and 1900s and 1910s, and then UK German competition, corporate competition, financial competition that start to spill over to become geopolitical competition. It went badly, become war. So it is the path and scenario they want to prevent. But at the same time that I am more optimistic about the current scenario, because back then in the early 20th century, that when this corporate competition between Germany and UK escalate, that it easily develop into this spheres of influence competitions and then easily lead to war. But now then in the 21st century, that US and China can have more arena to compete than pure sphere of influence, because we have the UN system and all these global governing institutions and the global financing, development finance, that they are all this arena that they are actually competing. And so the happiest scenario is to direct this competition to this competition. That the AIIB is an interesting example, and the BRIC banks and all this, and they are not as big as expected. People fear that they will take away business from the World Bank and IMF and Asian Development Bank and all these traditional lenders. But in the end, it created parallel institutions that create pressure for actually World Bank and IMF to reform its voting system. To become more inclusive, relatively, still less than people wanted. But they become more inclusive in increasing influence of developing countries in the voting system, and also, of course, in UN, in WHO. There's also a arena of competition between the two countries. So it is the scenario that is what we want to look at, that or channel the conflict to, that if the US and China competition can be channel to this, that is really that the world is big enough for two countries to coexist and even compete, and not only coexist, actually the competition, if it is channeled to right direction, actually competition is good. When US and China is working very closely, not competing, and actually is not exactly very good for many people. When you have competition, that as a third country, you have choice. It is what many, so it's why global south is very important. When the dominating capital exporter and political power are in unison, and the global south feels suffocated, they don't have much choice when US and China speak in one voice. Now US and China is competing, and then the global south in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Middle East, in in Latin America, definitely they feel they have choice. They can negotiate better, get a better deal from either one of them. So actually that this competition is actually good, and the world definitely is big enough for the competing two big powers. If the condition is that if we channel the competition to the right place rather than to the deadly place that we don't want to see.
That's great. That also covers Adela's question, also on the outlook of U.S.-China relationship. Professor Hong, would you please talk a little bit more about Jen's first question? How might decoupling benefit U.S.
Oh yeah.
corporations?
Yeah, actually, the decoupling. I published a recent paper in the journal Development and Change. Look at this kind of a U.S.-China decoupling, comparing rhetorics and reality during the COVID pandemic. And we find that actually the decoupling is a kind of again the catchphrase. But you look at the trade data and investment data that there's certain area that is decoupling. For example, that U.S. Portfolio investment in Chinese stock market, equity market. So it is really decoupling that not only because of U.S. new regulation about U.S. companies uh, or financiers, banks investing in Chinese equity, but also because of China is actually getting closer and closer in the financial sector, and we read in news about this kind of a crackdown on this foreign consultancy firm, and the the new data security law is really an issue that now many companies they have a branch in China, they find it like walking a fine line in transferring financial data back to their mother company in the US, that it can be violating law. So they need to separate the servers and data and things like that. So it is for financial investment, it is really bad that you can't research on the firms pretty much that you are investing in. So in terms of finance, it's really decoupling is really happening. And it is not exactly very damaging to the US. And you look at the profitability of the financial firm and performance in Wall Street and things like that, because we see that this kind of emerging market minus China now is booming. That this financial money always have place to go to. If China be not a choice, then they just go to India and Indonesia. There's other kind of a booming stock market. So they have alternative, but in terms of trade, that the decoupling is actually not happening as much as we envision. That you look at the trade data, there's still going on a lot, and also even in the high tech sector that is affected by the by tariff and things like that, you see that a lot of Chinese investment in Mexico and other places, in Vietnam definitely. So a lot of this kind of China used to be export from China just show up now and become export from Mexico, export from Vietnam, and many of them are Chinese companies. So this decoupling, and even a Chinese company in China is still exporting a lot to the US. So in terms of trade, and I don't see this decoupling actually happening a lot. But in investment in finance, that definitely it is happening, but it actually hurt the China side more than you compare the stock market's performance in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Wall Street. You know that actually it hurt China more than the US, that because China still lead capitalization and fundraising. A lot of these companies, particularly in this indebtedness, they need to issue bonds in the international markets, and if the environment is still that unfavorable for foreign portfolio investment into the Chinese market, then China, the many companies will be in trouble, and not so much for the US part, because there's the rest of the world that for these bankers to play with all the time, and but China, and because and then Chinese financial decoupling is not only affecting US firm, but Japanese firms, European firms, and all the same. So it is another story in the financial part of it.
Great. We have one more question, and this one is about domestic American politics.
Yeah.
So, what differences are there between Republicans and Democrats in terms of US-China relations? Or will US foreign policy remain unchanged no matter who comes to power? On the other hand, has Chinese foreign policy changed from interventionism to a more hegemonic foreign policy under President Xi?
Yeah, actually, then on the US side, definitely the big direction of deterioration won't change. But there's a subtle difference between two different administration, the Republican and Democrat. And definitely the Republican side is that traditionally they are more hawkish geopolitically, and it will gear towards more the military type of confrontation and containment on the Republican side, and the Democrats is always like want to tone down the military part of it and talk more about this technology and industrial policy, because like there is the kind of structure of support of definitely that the Democrat has a lot of this union base, and still though union is not as strong as before, but the organized labor is a strong voice, and even back in the 1990s they have been talking about this China trade as a job killer, and then they definitely welcome a lot of foreign investment and reshoring back in the US, or even Chinese investment in the US, building factories, creating jobs. So it is this kind of a trade and tariff and economic competition that it will be more the focus relatively definitely that we also see the convergence, and even in Republican side that we need to talk about which kind of Republican. You look at Marco Rubio, that is already talking about this like creating jobs and labors and manufacturing and industrial policy, while some the Republican is talking more about this kind of the U.S. military, the supremacy and in the Pacific and things like that. But the big thing is convergence, and on the subtle the difference will still be significant. For example, in the Democratic current administration, it definitely emphasized more on investing in U.S. influence in international organization like the UN, WHO, and things like that. They see that it is the major arena to compete with China and building up alliance, strengthening the alliance with Europe and Japan. But in previous Trump administration, basically that they don't see this international organization as an arena of competition, that so much so that they even tend to get US out of this competition, like in the from this institution, like the UN system and the WHO, so much so that to leave the arena for China to dominate. So it is the big difference, but again, that overall that I don't see this kind of the big difference will stand in the way on the big direction. And on the China side, that I try to depersonalize this kind of a Xi Jinping factor in all this. Of course, Xi Jinping himself has some role to play, but actually that I am, some people accuse me of being structuralist, and I am, but you can see that how Xi Jinping policy evolved from his first years in 2013 and 2014 to nowadays. You can see that really there's a structural force to move him to this current direction. In the beginning, the first 2 years, like this, like structural supply side, structural reform, and all this. That he sounds like a liberal, at least economically, and try all this kind of thing, but it didn't work, and then so he moved back to this double down on this Hu Jintao started the direction that Hu Jintao started. That is the state enterprise at the expense of private enterprise. And this kind of securitization and emphasis on security, even at the expense of the economy, is also the kind of a structural force that I'm sure that they see that there's the economy, that there's nothing much that they can do to turn around. They can do some minor thing, here and there, but not changing direction. So that what they worry about most is, of course, that how the current regime can weather this economic storm. So securitizing, weatherizing the regime against any economic headwind will be the priority. So I will see this as a kind of a rational kind of response to this kind of inevitable economic problem. So again, that Xi Jinping himself has a personal factor, but you look at his competition with Bo Xilai back in the early 2000s, people really expect Xi Jinping is the liberal and Bo Xilai is a statist. But then Bo Xilai was down, and then he became kind of celebrated in the Western world as a kind of a liberal winner in that rung of kind of elite struggles, and then he moved to that Bo Xilai direction eventually. So it is the structural force that is the most important, I think.
That is a super interesting analysis of the policy trajectory of Xi Jinping. And I want to thank Professor Hong also for giving such a lively discussion and a wonderful and informative talk on US-China relations and the role of corporate interest. I would encourage our audience, anyone who's interested in this topic, to check out Professor Hong's latest book, Clash of Empires. And I want to thank everybody to come to CPERS, and please stay tuned. We will have 2 more events this semester. Hope everybody will have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.